Hey everybody, welcome to Sequence. My name's Nick, and we're going to spend the next few minutes going over setting up a rainy day fund and the differences between a rainy day fund and an emergency fund. Now, those two words are used interchangeably in a lot of personal finance, but in reality, they are two different types of accounts used for two different types of purposes. So we're going to explain what they are, how they're used, and how to set them up inside of Sequence so that you're all set and can accomplish all of your financial goals. So with that, let's get started. A rainy day fund is really just a savings account that accounts for the different types of expenses that are probably typical or somewhat expected. Things that might come up on a month-to-month basis where a bill might be a little bit higher than usual, or things that you don't necessarily account for in your monthly budget but are probably going to happen over time. Some of those things could be your kids getting braces or some type of routine medical expense that you didn't account for, maybe a vet bill or small car repair, things like that. Now, depending on what personal finance expert you listen to or your own personal financial setup, a rainy day fund typically has between $500 and $5,000. You might say that's a pretty big swing, but that also accounts for people making $30,000 a year to $400,000 a year, right? We all have different financial situations, and thus we need a different amount based on our current setup. So if you're on the lower income end, maybe $500 is going to be sufficient to have as this little overage account for your rainy day fund. Whereas if you're making $100,000 plus, you might feel more comfortable with $5,000 in a rainy day fund. So now that we understand rainy day funds, let's get a better understanding of what the difference is between a rainy day fund and an emergency fund. Here's a good breakdown. On the left-hand side, we have the rainy day fund. It's for those uh-ohs, right? The $500 to $5,000 that we talked about. On the right-hand side, we see emergency funds. Those are for true emergencies. We typically like to see people having 3 to 6 months of living expenses, and your most common examples for needing an emergency fund are things like when you lose a job or an income, or large car repairs, property damage, other unexpected family emergencies. So that is the core difference between those two pieces and why it's important to have both. Now, you could combine them into one and just have a little bit more in your emergency fund, but we like to keep all of these different accounts separate. So let's take a look and dive into Sequence and see how we can best build it. We're going to need to add a port. Now, if you don't know what a port is already, it's just our terminology for adding an income, right? You are making money now. Maybe you have one income source. Maybe you have two, maybe you have three, maybe you have 10. Every income source needs a port because that is the entry point for that money to get into Sequence so that we can start to make all of these rules and set up the wonderful automation. We're going to stick with a pretty common example here, just with a single income to start. And again, I always like to label these pretty clearly. So I'm going to say in our case, we're talking to John and we're going to talk about salary. So in this case, John's salary is here. Let's say John is making $10,000 a month. And there we have it. Now, you're also probably going to have your typical checking and savings. So in previous videos, you've probably already seen the difference between ports, accounts, and pods. So I'm not going to go into details there, but we're going to quickly add a checking and a savings account to, again, mimic the most common situations that we see here at Sequence. So I'm going to add a checking account. I'm going to add an additional savings account. And as you know, in the playground environment, it's going to automatically add some random numbers into each of these accounts. Your numbers will be linked to the actual balance inside of your accounts. Now that we have the salary and we have a checking and savings, as you were talking about emergency funds and rainy day funds, we're going to do this a little bit differently now. So in these instances, I like to use a pod because a pod creates a separate account with a account number, a routing number, a real bank account that allows us to easily send money to. I'm going to click Add Pod, and I'm going to call this Rainy Day Fund. And you'll see it's right there. Now I'm going to create another pod, and I'm going to call this Emergency Fund. So now I have everything I need to get started to create both my rules for the rainy day fund and the emergency fund. And as you probably know, but if you don't know yet, the way you create rules is simply by clicking the plus button and dragging to any one of your accounts or pods. And then you'll get this screen. What type of rule would you like to create? You can either trigger it by incoming funds or trigger it by a date. For most of our cases, including this one, we're going to do trigger by incoming funds because every time John gets paid, we want this rule to take place. I've created a rule, and now my action is I have the option to transfer a percentage of incoming funds, transfer a fixed amount, round down, or top up. So in this case, because we're just getting started, I'm going to click transfer a fixed amount. And I'm going to say I want to transfer a fixed amount of $150 into the rainy day fund. Save. Now I've created that rule. So every time John gets paid, $150 extra will go into that rainy day fund. If he's getting paid bi-weekly, that means essentially 2 times a month, he's going to be putting $150 into that fund, or $300 per month. Now, if I want to create an additional rule, I can click and drag again, trigger by incoming funds, and you'll note it actually adds on to my existing rule here. So in this case, I want to transfer another fixed amount of, let's call it $500 into the emergency fund. I'm going to click save. And now I have my 2 rules. And lastly, I can click and drag a new rule. I'm going to trigger by incoming funds. And what you'll note is I'm going to transfer the remaining 100% of my paycheck into the checking account. So now all of a sudden I have 3 rules created. Rainy day fund, $150 per pay, $500 per pay to the emergency fund, and the remaining money over to checking. I hope this was helpful. In next videos, we're going to talk about even more rules so that you can start to create the best possible outcome for you and your financial future. Talk to you soon, and happy savings.